If, in a man-to-man fight, the winner is he who has one more round in his magazine, would you give your enemy a spare magazine? Welcome to episode 10 of the Principles of War podcast, Sustainment in the Malaya Campaign. Team, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're going to be talking about probably one of the least considered of the principles, but one that is absolutely fundamental to the Malaya Campaign. And not only is it really important to get an understanding of the logistics plans for both the Allies and for the Japanese, but I think the thing that is most fundamental about it is the interplay between the two. Because you wouldn't normally think that there'd be a significant relationships between the logistic plans of combatants. But this is something that plays a huge part in the success of the Japanese plan. So, sustainment from LWD1. Sustainment refers to the support arrangements necessary to implement strategies and operational plans. These arrangements include those logistics and personnel efforts necessary for the efficient support of a force committed to operations. This refers to the requirements to logistically support a large number of small, dispersed combat teams without revealing the location of those teams to the enemy. In a contemporary context, sustainment may also extend to other actors or stakeholders, such as non-combatants. Now, that's the current doctrine that the Army fights with today. Probably the big differences that the British Army would have been looking at as they were talking about it was that they weren't as dispersed. And it was a lot harder to find where your enemy was. So there was less of a requirement to supply dispersed combat teams, and revealing their location was less of an issue. In Malaya, I think that when you look at the logistics plans for the two sides, for the British, I think really it was business as usual. A lot of wheeled transport to be able to move supplies. So it wasn't really deemed to be a significant part of the operation. The same can't be said for the Japanese, though, because of the fact that they were moving at an incredibly fast pace, which naturally puts a significant amount of pressure on their logistics units. And that's what we're hoping to sort of delve into in this podcast. Now, the quote that we started out with, that was a quote from Rommel in his incredibly educational book, Infantry Attacks, which was written in the interwar period about his experiences as a company commander in World War I. One of the other quotes from Rommel that I think is really important when you're thinking about logistics is that the battle is won by the quartermasters before the fighting begins. I think that's a really important quote, and it really harks back to the early days of Sun Tzu, when Sun Tzu said that victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. So looking at the British, they had lots of trucks, lots of really good roads. The road network was really coming along, and that had been driven by the economic activity around the tin and rubber, as well as the other products that Malaya was supplying to the empire. So there was really quite a lot going for the British as far as their ability to sustain their forces. One of the issues that they did have in preparing for the campaign was the fact that Percival had significant financial constraints placed upon him. Now, the War Office had allocated a budget of £5 million for the whole of 1941. Percival's problem was that by April, he had spent £4 million of that. Now, to put that in a little bit of context, so £5 million would equate to around $300 and $700 million today, which is just over $500 million in Australian. However, compare that with Australia's defence budget, which is just under $35 billion. So the amount of money that's been allocated by the War Office for the defence of Malaya and Singapore is minuscule. And Percival's ceiling for writing off expenditure, which would be increased once operational activities commenced. So once operational activities commenced, he would be able to spend the grand sum of £500 without seeking further authorisation. Now, remember, he was a lieutenant general at this time. So £500, around £30,000 in today's money. So not a lot of money that was available, and he had very little flexibility in spending that money. And these problems manifested themselves on the ground. There's a letter from the state engineer in Pahang to the CRE, the Chief Royal Engineer of 9th Indian Division, and he's saying that the work on the pillboxes will commence once there's been a payment of $5,000. So it's very hard to get a lot of this work that needs to be done paid for. Not only that, there was a significant shortage in labour, and that was because the War Office refused to increase the labour rates above Indian scales. So they had these scales that you would pay for Indian labour. It was actually really cheap because the expectation from the War Office was that most of the labour would come from India. Now, the Colonial Office, on the other hand, refused to allow more Indians to come in because there was a fear of backlash from the Indian workers in Malaya. They were paid very little, they were treated very harshly, and it was creating significant tension. There was no conscription for the fear that it would show the weakness of British power. So you couldn't pay to get the work done, and you couldn't do the work yourself. This is one of the issues that led up to an inability for the British to prepare well for the oncoming offensive. Now, tactically, the British were hoping to create strong defensive locations, prepared ground, chosen ground, and then attrit the Japanese forces as they came up with their artillery and dramatically slow the advance. That was the general scheme of manoeuvre, with some slow withdrawals to pre-prepared positions. So when you're fighting a defensive battle like that, obviously caches and dumps, you bring your supplies forward so that they are available to the troops because they could be in location for a significant amount of time. You don't want to be clogging the main supply routes with convoys bringing up ammunition and food and water. You want to dump as much of it forward so that it is there available, particularly if the MSR is interdicted by enemy action. So let's have a quick look at the defense. And there's a couple of reasons why you're going to want to be on the defense. You're going to be looking to defeat or destroy the enemy on the ground of the defender's choice. Now, we've already discussed a lot of the time this wasn't available to Percival because of the fact that the ground that needed to be defended had been chosen by the RAF when they placed their air bases on the ground. You might want to deny decisive terrain. You might want to gain time to prepare for offensive action. This, at a strategic level, this is the big deal. This is what the whole game is about. We want to deny the Japanese the ability to take the Singapore base before the reinforcements from around the world, from the Commonwealth and other allies, can come and restore the situation and to go on to the offense. You might want to protect or shield another force, and in a lot of areas they were doing this with the airfields, and of course they were doing it with the Singapore base. You want to avoid destruction or unacceptable losses, and that was also a significant consideration. And lastly, to support or enable other operations. Now, we're not really sure of what the scheme of manoeuvre was for the Malaya defence, and to be perfectly honest, I don't think that there was a well thought out plan. And if there was, it certainly fell apart after those initial contacts because the tempo that the Japanese were able to generate was significantly greater than which the defenders were able to deal with. But I think that they were really aiming for a mix of the area defence and mobile defence. So picking very strong areas with which they were going to be able to inflict significant losses on the Japanese. And they were able to do this in a couple of places. The Battle of Ipoh was a really good example of this. So the 11th Indian Division was able to inflict significant casualties and significant delay. They were there for 4 days on the Japanese. They inflicted so many casualties that the 41st Regiment was unable to take part in the attack on Singapore. And it was only when they were dislocated out of the position by an amphibious landing that they were forced to withdraw. And this was Percival's preference. because of the fact that it meant that they were maintaining a big distance between the air bases, which once the Japanese had, they would then be able to attack Singapore. So he needed to maintain that gap to preserve the port. At a tactical level, the mobile defence was always available to them, and it played into their strengths of significant wheeled mobility. The problem for them was, of course, the Japanese tactics of encirclement and fighting for the road off the road, which meant that they were often surrounded. And that required them to conduct retrograde actions, so being the delay and the withdrawal. And there were multiple examples of this, and the problem was that they just weren't rehearsed. So often these were occurring at night, and they collapsed into complete shambles with no one knowing who was where. It was very difficult to coordinate these activities, and from a sustainment point of view, it was very difficult to get the supplies out of the location. And this is a fundamental problem. The withdrawal is particularly difficult to do. You've got forces that are probably in contact. Morale can take a significant hit, and often the majority of the casualties are inflicted in the withdrawal as the withdrawal degenerates into a rout. So it's incredibly important that it is well rehearsed and it is done with everyone knowing what their part is in the withdrawal. This didn't happen. We know that Gordon Bennett didn't like people rehearsing the withdrawal because he thought it was defeatist. And I think there were elements of that amongst the British Army as well. And this meant that rather than being timely, well-controlled withdrawals, they were often very hasty. And, of course, the supplies were the last consideration. You get yourself out, then you get your weapons, and if you can, you think about the supplies last. This didn't happen on a lot of occasions. So, what did this mean for the Japanese? Nothing highlights the mismatch in operational art between Percival and Yamashita than Yamashita's decision to leave one division as a theatre reserve. So he'd been allocated 4 divisions. He didn't take the 56th Infantry Division. He left that as a theatre reserve. This, I think, really fundamentally shows the amount of planning that had gone into the Malayan offensive. So Admiral Hyman Rickover said, "Bitter experience in war has taught me the maxim that the art of war is the art of the logistically feasible." Yamashita knew that he had limited, his sea lines of communication were going to be very, very constrained. So not only did he need to get his troops ashore, not only did he need to get his equipment ashore, but he then needed to get the supplies to be able to feed his vehicles and his men. So the more men that he had in Malaya, the more pressure he was going to be putting on those sea lines of communication. And remember, when he's planning this, these sea lines of communication aren't secure. So it's not until Fort Said goes to the bottom of the sea that those sea lines of communication become relatively secure. Obviously, there's still a small air threat after that, but that was decreasing day by day as attrition to the RAF and the RAAF increases. But he is thinking, how am I going to supply all of these soldiers with the number of ships that he had available to him? So he chose to keep a division as a theatre reserve. And I think that is probably one of the great insights into his operational acumen. Now, the next piece in the jigsaw puzzle, I think, really comes down to the fact that you'd rather be lucky than good on any given day. Yamashita was really lucky. Having said that, I think he made a lot of his own luck. The best example of this is the fact that when the Japanese troops got into the officers' mess at Alor Star, there was hot porridge on the table for them. That really gives you an indication of the rush with which that airfield was abandoned. That night, Japanese planes attacked Allied troops. They were fueled with British fuel and they were bombed with British bombs. None of the supplies had been destroyed at the airfield, which I find completely boggling. Blowing up a pole facility, I would have had to thought, would be a bit of fun. And the fact that this wasn't done, it just shows how hurried it was all done. And Yamashita came to refer to these supplies that he found in increasing numbers as the tempo of the operation increased as Churchill supplies. And there was just far too many of them. And I think that those initial Churchill supplies fed into an increase in operational tempo that meant that more Churchill supplies became available. Yamashita received enough supplies at Slim River for 2 brigades for a month. Now, that meant that he could allocate significantly less effort to sustainment because the British were sustaining 2 brigades for a whole month. This also meant that the path to Kuala Lumpur was clear, and they reached KL before the supplies there could be destroyed, which meant that they got more Churchill supplies. And I think that when you look at the grand scheme of things, the amount of supplies that were received in those early days enabled the maintenance of that tempo, which just meant that they got more and more of these supplies as the withdrawal broke down into pretty much a rout. And that underpinned the operational tempo that Yamashita was able to generate. Now, Major General Julian Thompson from the Royal Marines said that only a commander who understands logistics can push the military machine to the limits without risking total breakdown. This is what Yamashita did. So he made sure that he had only the number of troops that he required and no more, so that he could minimise the logistics burden for all of the troops within the theatre. And he then generated the tempo that was required to be able to get the supplies that was needed to maintain the operational tempo. And this is another one of those factors that feeds into this turbulent and rapidly deteriorating situation with which the enemy cannot cope. The Japanese just continue to move faster and faster and faster. They're continually threatening the rear areas, and their advance is pretty much relentless, meaning that the troops who are defending become increasingly sleep-deprived, increasingly demoralised, and increasingly likely to surrender, or, as we see later in the campaign, they'll actually pull out of well-prepared defensive positions before they need to because they've just lost their will to fight. Now, there was one other tactical innovation that I think really highlight an important component of the sustainment plan for Yamashita. And that is the fact that a lot of the infantry, and because they're all marching on the Mark I boot, which has a known rate of advance. And so it makes it really hard, even when you're chasing infantry, it makes it hard to close the gap on them and to move faster than them, to encircle them. So the obvious solution to that is, of course, to use wheeled vehicles because you can move a lot quicker. But for a wheeled vehicle, then there's the maintenance tail and the fuel supplies that need to be considered. Yamashita picked a third option. He went with bikes. So 30,000 bicycles were available for his infantry, and this enabled them to move at an incredible speed. Rather than clogging up the MSR with fuel to feed the vehicles, these are free. They're just powered by legs. So 30,000 troops moving by bicycle. Now, is that the best vehicle? Not really, because it's not a protected mobility vehicle by any stretch of the imagination. And the Japanese at Gamas found that out. That in an ambush, a bike is not going to protect you in any way, shape or form. But rather than having the security of properly formed up columns in properly manned vehicles, they used the security that was implied by speed. And that was the speed that the bicycles gave them. And it was the speed that was given to them by the lack of the requirement to wait for the logistics to catch up to them, to be able to fuel them to move forward. And that security, the security of the offense, the security of moving really quickly, meant that they were able to get, once again, that they were able to get more supplies, which meant that they were able to move even quicker. And I think that the thing that's really interesting about this is that this campaign is really quite reminiscent of Sherman's March to the Sea. Now, Sherman's March to the Sea occurred in the US Civil War from November 15 to December 21 in 1864. And William Tecumseh Sherman of the Union Army, he moves out from Atlanta and he moves through Georgia and ends up capturing the port of Savannah on December 21st. There was a scorched earth policy, destroying military targets as well as civilian infrastructure. Now, in planning for his march, he sends a telegram to Ulysses S. Grant, and part of it reads, "Until we can repopulate Georgia, it is useless to occupy it, but the utter destruction of its roads, houses, and people will cripple their military resources. By attempting to hold the roads, we will lose 1,000 men monthly and gain no result. I can make the march and make Georgia howl. We have over 8,000 cattle and 3 million pounds of bread, but no corn. But we can forage in the interior of the state." So Sherman set off on this march with 20 days' worth of rations. But he'd actually looked at 1860 census data to identify where he would be able to find livestock, and he also looked at crop production data so that he would be able to find areas where his troops would be able to forage most effectively. He had special details of troops who would go foraging off the line of march, and these were known as bummers, and they would go out and they would seize food from farms, and they would also destroy civilian infrastructure as well. The March to Sea was a great success, and Sherman telegraphed to President Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton." Now, if you're interested in the Civil War at all, you've probably read one or two of Lincoln's communications, and I think that one of his gifts was for the way that he was able to turn a phrase. And he replied back on the 26th of December, "Many, many thanks for your Christmas gift, the capture of Savannah. When you were leaving Atlanta for the Atlantic coast, I was anxious, if not fearful, but feeling that you were the better judge and remembering that nothing risked, nothing gained, I did not interfere. Now, the undertaking being a success, the honour is all yours, for I believe none of us went further than to acquiesce. And taking the work of General Thomas into account, as it should be taken, it is indeed a great success. Not only does it afford the obvious and immediate military advantage, but in showing to the world that your army could be divided, putting the stronger part to an important new service, and yet leaving enough to vanquish the old opposing force of the whole, Hood's army, it brings those who sat in darkness to see a great light. But what next? I suppose it will be safer if I leave General Grant and yourself to decide. Please make my grateful acknowledgements to your army, officers and men." So that's the kind of telegram that you want to be getting from the boss. The really interesting thing, the comparison between Sherman's march to the sea is that they had 20 days worth of provisions and they weren't gone for much longer than that. They did inflict a significant moral wound to the Confederacy with the scorched earth policy that they decided to use. But I think that the really big issue here is that there was no fuel that needed to be taken into consideration. So the March to the Sea has been held up as an example of a force being able to forage off the land, like in the days of Napoleon, but they're not having to rely on many of the new technological advances that differentiate the armies in the Civil War with those in World War II. Now, Yamashita, on the other hand, is able to do this down the entire length of Malaya. Now, he wasn't entirely living off the land, but he was able to move at a greatly increased rate because of the fact that he was able to liberate so much of the fuel and ammunition from the fleeing Allied forces. And I think this is the key message that needs to come out. And I think it's an obvious message that when you're conducting the withdrawal, you make sure that you don't leave behind any supplies. In the Malaya Campaign, supplies were left. Far too many supplies were left. Far too many supplies were left by far too many formations. And that enabled Yamashita to maintain the operational tempo that led to the rout of the Allies from Malaya and into Singapore. So that's about it for Sustainment. Next episode, we're going to finish the last of the principles, and that is morale.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.